I'm Lisa Rubel, and I'm so excited to be working with Sit and Sew Fabrics to share with you the Rainbow Kaleidoscope block of the month. You can see behind me here is our yellow and gray version, which is called the Sunshine and Shadows block of the month. And we've reimagined this quilt using fat quarters in a rainbow of colors. So each month will be black, white, and a color, and we'll work our way through the rainbow to make all 12 of these blocks and make a gorgeous rainbow hued quilt. So let's take a look at block number 1. Here is my stitched up block number 1 for the Rainbow Kaleidoscope version of our block of the month. And it uses aqua and then of course our neutrals of black and white. And the pattern that you'll receive has all of the instructions you need to stitch this block, shown in these colors. When you watch the video, you will see this block here being created in the yellow and gray, but you can see how it matches up. The dark gray is the black, the yellow and the light gray half square triangles are aqua in this version, and then the white background is the white. So it's easy to go back and forth between the two. I hope you enjoy sewing block 1. And I'll see you back here next month as we put together block 2. Hi, I'm Lisa Rubel from Love to Color My World, and I'm so glad that you're joining me on the Sunshine and Shadows block of the month quilt. In this video, we'll be working on block 1, which in my sample quilt is right here. And it's going to be based on a bunch of half square triangles. So I've got my fabric all cut already, and I'm going to get started on making the block. So the first thing we're going to do is take 3 of our white squares and turn them upside down and draw a diagonal line on the back side of them for making our half square triangles. So I've got a fabric marking pen I'm going to use for that. And I get all those done. We'll be pairing 2 of them with yellow squares. So I'm going to put those right sides together. And then the third one I will be pairing with the lighter gray that I'm using in this block. So you can see there's a darker gray that's used for these larger triangles, and then a lighter gray used out here. So right now I'm using the lighter gray. So what I'm going to do is take these over to my machine and sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance on both sides of that marked line. Okay, so I've got all 3 of mine stitched, a 1/4 inch on either side of that drawn line, and now I'm going to cut them apart on the drawn line. And if you look at the printed pattern, you'll notice that throughout there are recommended directions for pressing. Some of those are for light and dark of the fabric, and some of those are for just ease of assembling. So you can follow along with the arrows, and I'll talk about them as well. So for these half square triangles, I'm going to press the seam allowances towards the darker fabric in the grouping. I'm going to do that for all 6 of them. And then what we'll do is square them up so they measure 3.5 inches square. And the easiest way to do that for a smaller square like this is if you have a 6.5 inch square ruler. And I'll show you how that comes together. So for trimming one of these half square triangle units, I'm going to set it down. I've got my 6.5 inch square. I'm going to use this diagonal line, and I'm going to align it on my seam, but then also make sure that along these edges that the 3.5 inch lines are actually on the fabric, because I want to trim from all 4 sides to square it up as perfectly as possible. So I like to trim 2 sides at a time, and then turn it around 180 degrees. And now this time, I'm going to line up that 3.5 inch mark on the ruler with my cut edges and make sure that diagonal line goes right up the center of my unit and trim those last 2 edges. And I've got a perfect half square triangle. So I'm going to do that with all 6 of my half square triangles. So to make the first quarter block units for this block, we're going to use our yellow half square triangles. I'm going to lay 2 of those out with the yellow points touching, and then lay out 2 3.5-inch squares opposite those. And so we're just going to flip these right over and sew down the seam allowance to make a row for each of those. And now with these, I'm going to press away from my half square triangle. And by doing that on both of these units, when we go to join them together, those seam allowances will nest around the seams. So you can see I've got they're opposite each other. I'm going to put the pins in. Okay. And just sew right down that line. So here is my quarter block unit using the yellow half square triangles. And that should measure 6.5 inches square. Looks good. The next step is to cut some squares diagonally in half to make triangles. We're going to start out with the larger gray square. I'm going to line up my ruler from corner to corner and cut. Now after you have these triangles cut, you want to be careful how you handle them, because this edge is now bias, and so it will be stretchy. So try not to pull on it or handle it too much. And then we're going to cut the last 2 4-inch squares diagonally in half as well. And now to lay out a quarter unit of the block, we've got our large triangle, and we're going to set up 2 of those smaller light triangles, and you see they overlap, and that's okay. And then 1 of our gray half square triangles, just like that. So what we're going to do is sew these 2 together, and notice I've got the dark side pointing in so that it touches that triangle. If you do it this way, you get a totally different look. So we're going to do it this way, and you want to align this straight edge with that straight edge. So you'll have a tip that extends down at the bottom, and that's okay. We'll use that for our seam allowance. So I'm going to sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance right down there. And then you can see from the pressing, we're going to press towards that white triangle. So here's what we've got. And then I'm going to do the same thing here. And I'm going to align this long straight edge with this, and then sew these together. And again, my tip will extend, and that is okay, because that's creating our seam allowance. Okay, and as the directions say, we're going to press towards that triangle. And now when I've been talking about seam allowance, what I'm talking about is right here, because our next step is going to be to sew these together, and that will get eaten up basically in the seam allowance. But before I sew them, I am going to trim off those little tips right there. So I've got my large gray triangle and my piece triangle, and I'm going to flip it over, and you see they are the same size, which is great. That's how they're supposed to be. So I'm going to put a couple pins in to hold it. Now you are sewing bias cut edges here, so they are stretchy, so you want to pin a little more than you maybe would usually. So I'm going to sew 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way down here. When you get to this middle part, you want to, I'm going to use a pin to point it out, you'll see where the seams cross, and you want your stitch to be just a hair to the side of that, to the outside edge this way, because that way when you flip it open, that point will be perfectly nestled on the seam line of that gray triangle. Okay, so I've got mine stitched. I'm going to come over, we're going to press the seams toward the darker triangle the dark gray triangle, and let's see how I did. Oh, look at that. I've got a nice point right there, right on the edge. Fantastic. So the next thing I'm going to do is trim this up to 6.5 inches square. And again, that diagonal line on the ruler is our friend, because that will ensure that you keep the points on the other two corners. You might have nothing to trim. You might, besides these, just the little ears in the corner, and you might have a little to trim. It just all depends on your piecing. But get that trimmed up. All right. And here we've got a 1/4 block. So we're going to make 2 of these for this block. So we're almost done. Once you have all 4 of your 1/4 block units sewn, the 2 yellow and the 2 gray, it's time to join these together, and month 1, block number 1, will be complete. So what we're going to do is lay them out. Now, when you're laying out portions of the block, or even these 1/4 block units, you want to just double check that you've got the orientation of your block correct before you sew. And sometimes double check, because this is how it's supposed to look, but say you do this one here, all of a sudden you've got them sewn together and out comes your friend, the seam ripper. So double check with the pattern that you've got it correct. I've got my 2 dark gray triangles touching, and my yellow half square triangles make little diagonal bow ties going along this way. So what I'm going to do is to fold each of these units over so that the right sides are together, and pin, and then sew using a 1/4 inch seam allowance down both of these units. So I've got my units sewn together in 2 rows, and per the arrows on the pattern, I'm going to press both towards that darker gray triangle. And again, by doing that, my seams will nest when I go to sew these 2 units together. And now same thing here. You know, once you've got these pressed and you lay them back out to pin together, just take one more look to make sure that you've got them oriented correctly so that you don't have to pull out your seam ripper. So I've got my pieces together. I'm going to flip this top one over and pin right at that seam allowance, and I've got seams going this way and this way so they nest nicely, and then pin along the outer edges as well, and sew this last seam. And here is my finished block for month 1. There we go. I look forward to seeing you next month when we'll sew block number 2, which is this one. And we'll work our way through the entire Sunshine and Shadows quilt until we've got it done.